Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we're honored to be joined by a dear friend of AJC, Professor Erwin Cutler, International Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism. Professor Cutler, in conversation with Felice Gare, AJC Director of the Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, will discuss Holocaust denial and distortion, the dangerous impact they have around the world, and the need to stay vigilant against this hate. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Felice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As you all know, today, January 27th, is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It marks the 77th day, or 77th year, since the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp, the concentration camp, so notorious, where well more than 1 million people were murdered. The International Day is focused on remembrance in commemoration of the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. Now, the United Nations has marked this occasion annually since 2005. And they had an event just earlier today, which I hope you have seen or you can view separately on the UN's web TV channel. It was virtual because of the pandemic, but it was just as moving as the 16 previous meetings have been. Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke quite movingly about anti-Semitism, the difference that one person can make between life and death, and did during the Holocaust. And he quoted the working definition of anti-Semitism and talked about the ongoing problems and the need to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. As we speak about this day, we have a focus, of course, on honoring the victims. So what constitutes honoring the victims? Well, Sarah Bloomfield, the head of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, reminded us a couple of years ago that when she spoke at the Jacob Blaustein Institute's program, she reminded us that you honor the victims by remembering their lives, the horror of their death, and the fact that we failed them, and that we must not fail them again by forgetting or by ignoring rising anti-Semitism today. I am so pleased that the Honorable Erwin Cutler, Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, has agreed to join us today. He is the former Attorney General of Canada and a renowned human rights lawyer. As Special Envoy, he's also the head of Canada's delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and other international fora. He's also a member of the Administrative Council of AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights. Professor Cutler, a few hours ago, the UN held its annual International Holocaust Remembrance event. We think it's an important event, but it's more than 75 years since the Holocaust and the end of World War II. Can you tell us, why do we need a special day to mark remembrance of the Holocaust and its victims?
Well, Felice, first, may I thank you and the AJC, the Jacob Blaustein Institute, for organizing this timely and significant forum on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which, as you mentioned, marks the 77th anniversary of the liberation of the death camp Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, a laboratory for mass murder where there are no graves. 1.3 million people were deported to the death camp Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it, and why it is so important to remember and mark this day. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism itself did not die at Auschwitz. It remains the bloody canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And as we've learned, and I've said this many times, as we've learned only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And as Dr. Ahmed Shahid, who presented the landmark report to the United Nations a little over 2 years ago, and has been a frequent intervenant in support of both Holocaust remembrance, awareness, and action. But as he put it, and put it best in his report, that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies, that it is a threat to our common humanity. And so we need, at this point, to not only see International Holocaust Remembrance Day as being an important act of remembrance, which it is, but to see it also as a remembrance to act on behalf of that common humanity that Dr. Ahmed Shahid was speaking about, on behalf of the promotion and protection of democracies, to learn the universal lessons of the Holocaust, which include the dangers of silence in the face of evil, the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity.
Thank you, Professor Kotler. You know, I mentioned that since 2005, the United Nations has made a point of making Holocaust Remembrance Day a meaningful opportunity, an opportunity to remember, an opportunity to reflect, and an opportunity to remind ourselves to act on the lessons of the Holocaust. And members of the Jewish communities have been invited to attend in person. We at AJC have invited our diplomatic contacts to attend to demonstrate the significance they attach to this day, and frankly, for them to be able to learn a little bit about the Holocaust as well. The UN has invited high-profile speakers such as yourself to address the event. Now, the United Nations was founded in 1945. Its leaders and member states never used the word Holocaust until Secretary General Kofi Annan denounced the Holocaust in 1998 on the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Convention Against Genocide. At that time, he asked, why weren't there more Rauls? Referring, of course, to Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat and rescuer. Professor Kotler, you're the head of Canada's Raoul Wallenberg Center. Can you tell us why Raoul Wallenberg has become such a powerful symbol of the Holocaust, and what are the lessons of the Holocaust?
So first of all, with regard to Kofi Annan, I would meet with him over the years because he himself was married to someone from the Wallenberg family. But there was something that Kofi Annan once said to me that I've never forgotten, and it relates to your overall context, re the UN, when he said that a United Nations that does not put the combating of anti-Semitism at the forefront of its agenda is the United Nations that betrays its past and forfeits its future. It's something that I never forgot, and something we must particularly pay heed to, as anti-Semitism is often laundered under the very protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, the struggle against racism, which brings me, therefore, to Raoul Wallenberg, Canada's first honorary citizen and honorary citizen also of the United States, of Israel, of Australia, who demonstrate how one person with the capacity, the compassion to care, and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. It is sometimes forgotten, if it is even always known, that from the middle of May 1944 to the beginning of July 1944, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to the death camp Auschwitz, the quickest, cruelest, most efficient killing field in all of the Holocaust, taking place amidst the international bystander community, who at that point, nobody could say, we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Raoul Wallenberg arrived as a diplomat in the Swedish legation in Budapest in mid-July 1944, and through a mixture of inspiration and ingenuity, bravado and bluff, together with others that he mobilized, diplomats and the like, managed to save 100,000 Jews in the last 6 months of 44 and the beginning of 45. So what the entire international bystander community did not do, as our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said recently in commemorating Raoul Wallenberg on Raoul Wallenberg Day, one person with integrity showed how one person could make a difference. And I just want to say that Wallenberg and his heroism also presaged what today we would call international human rights and humanitarian law. Very quickly, in the dispersal of Schutzpass, diplomatic passes to the recipients, he conferred diplomatic immunity on those recipients, and setting up safe houses as sanctuaries for the inhabitants. He, through these two means alone, saved some 30,000 Jews. In establishing soup kitchens, hospitals, orphanages, providing a semblance of human dignity amidst the horrors of the Holocaust to the elderly, the sick, the disabled, and the like, Wallenberg demonstrated what today we call international humanitarian assistance, and protecting and rescuing Jews on death marches, on death transports to Auschwitz, removing them from those marches and transport. He gave expression to what we today call international humanitarian intervention, or the responsibility to protect. And perhaps his last heroism was maybe one of the most important. When the Nazi generals were marching on Budapest and threatening to blow up the Budapest ghetto and liquidate its 70,000 Jews, Wallenberg warned them that they would be held accountable and arguably executed for their crimes. In this, he presaged what became the Nuremberg Principles and international criminal law, and showed us of the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity. When asked why he did all this, he answered in his modest way, "For me, there was no other choice." That should be the memorandum that we should imprint on all our actions.
Incredible story and incredible man. Thank you for honoring him as you do by your work every day at the Institute.
There's just one thing, if I might add, please,
Sure.
is that, when the Soviets entered Hungary as liberators in 1945, rather than greet Raoul Wallenberg as the rescuer that he was, they arrested him and he disappeared into the Gulag. His fate and whereabouts never to become known. I chaired an international commission of inquiry into fate and whereabouts of Raoul Wallenberg, together with his brother Guy von Dardel and others. And we determined, as a US court case had determined in 1985, that the evidence was incontrovertible that Wallenberg did not die in 1947, as the Soviets claimed he did, and compelling that he was alive in the 50s and 60s. I say this because, regrettably, the person, Raoul Wallenberg, who saved so many, was never saved by so many who could. And we have now announced that we are going to mobilize the countries of Wallenberg's honorary citizenship to seek the truth as to what in fact happened to Wallenberg, to have the Russians open up the archives so that we can bring truth and justice to his legacy and to his family and to all those he saved.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Professor Cutler, unfortunately, this last year has seen anti-Semitic rhetoric and acts committed at apparently unprecedented levels in many countries, including but not limited to Canada and the United States. Our own reporting has shown this, and so have reports from monitors around the world. But over the last year, it seems as if there's been an unprecedented outpouring also of recognition by government leaders that global anti-Semitism is indeed dangerous. Some leaders have suggested they want to do something about it. Canadian government created Your Position beginning of last year. They convened the first ever national summit on anti-Semitism in July and made a series of rather important commitments at a gathering of governments, technical companies, and other leaders in Malmö, Sweden in October. We've also seen the European Commission step up its efforts to drive action to combat anti-Semitism throughout the continent. And at the United Nations last week, all governments, except Iran, joined in welcoming a new resolution condemning Holocaust denial and distortion. So as we're now at the beginning of 2022, I wonder if you consider these new commitments to be a sign that the tide is turning, that governments have finally recognized how dangerous unchecked anti-Semitism really is, and whether they're reflecting greater awareness worldwide of the danger of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and distortion. And could you share with us your recommendations about how we can hold some of those governments to their commitments?
Well, I think those expressions of leadership, as you've recalled them, do reflect an important inflection moment and growing awareness amongst political leaders. But at the same time, I have to tell you, having concluded my first year as special envoy, that there are a number of converging or intersecting dynamics that also concern me and which we must address to round out the picture. The first is what I would call the mainstreaming, normalization, legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political and campus culture, an absence of outrage, as David Harris himself has put it, underpinned by indifference and inaction. Second is the globalization of the phenomenon, that what happens in London, England, and Paris reverberates in New York and in Montreal. Not only reverberates, but replicates itself. For example, when a convoy marched through the streets of London in May 2021 amidst the Hamas war against Israel, they were shouting, "F the Jews will rape your daughters." In a kind of orchestrated campaign, a similar convoy with similar chants went through streets in Canada. The third thing that has concerned me this past year has been what I would call the marginalization of anti-Semitism in this larger struggle against racism. Indeed, we need to be concerned about systemic racism, as I've said, in Canada against Indigenous people, Blacks and people of color, discrimination against Asian Canadians and Muslim Canadians. But what concerns me, having examined educational and training programs within and without government, is that anti-Semitism is marginalized in those education and training programs, marginalized in these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and the like. And the final thing is the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism, where, for example, Jewish students on campus are being forced to choose sometimes between their Jewish identity and acceptance in the campus culture, where they are marginalized, bullied, excluded as being part of the white, if not supremacist class, and as apologists for the apartheid state Israel. So I think these are dynamics that are of concern, and what we need to do about it more is, I think all countries should have a kind of national summit to combat anti-Semitism and set up a national action plan as a result of that summit and implement country pledges that they have made at Malmö regarding anti-Semitism and internationalize the struggle against anti-Semitism so that we work together in common cause and not in differentiated silos.
Thank you for those suggestions. Obviously, you are leading the way in Canada with a national summit, and I don't know if you have a national action plan yet, but I can tell you soon will. You know, we have to raise questions too about other things that are going on. The governments that are not pledging to do more to fight anti-Semitism, and in fact that are actually stirring it up. I mentioned how at this rather solemn adoption of a resolution at the UN about Holocaust denial and distortion, Iran made a point of dirtying the whole procedure with its remarks and repetition of the Zionism is racism canard and other things of that sort. But we see this from not just from Iran, but from other countries that condemn Zionism or that conflate Jews in Israel, or that are embarked in a rather dangerous game of historical revisionism concerning their countries' and citizens' role in collaboration with the Nazis during World War II. We also see it right now. Secretary General mentioned it this morning from opposition politicians, populist figures, often in Western countries, who are increasingly willingly invoking the symbols and memories of the Holocaust in a grotesque comparison. They equate their opposition to government regulation aimed at saving lives during the pandemic to the treatment of the Jews and their mass murder by the Nazis. They're inspiring huge numbers of ordinary people to join them by echoing harmful narratives that diminish the suffering of the Jews and others in the Holocaust. Professor Kotler, how can we more effectively address these alternative sources of Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism that so far have seemed to be totally resistant to being shamed or pressured into changing their behavior?
Well, you know, the UN General Assembly resolution to combat Holocaust denial and distortion came at an important historical moment on the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee conference, where the Nazi leadership had gathered for, quote, the final solution to the Jewish question, and the international community there was a bystander community. And when you mention Iran, it reminds me that the 21st century began with the Supreme Leader Khamenei saying on January 3rd, 2000, that there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. He didn't even use the euphemism Zionism, a trope that he had been repeating and others have repeatedly since. What we ignore is that the Genocide Convention doesn't only prohibit acts of genocide, but as our Supreme Court of Canada put it, it prohibits incitement to genocide. Yet to date, not one country in the international community has held Iran to account. And your country, my country, most states are state parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which prohibits incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence. And so we have to remind states of their commitments, and in particular also the commitment to protect against incitement to genocide. Second, we need a zero tolerance principle and policy re anti-Semitism. That is to say, we have to guard against the weaponization of anti-Semitism for political purposes, where Democrats call it out amongst Republicans or Republicans call it out amongst Democrats. We have to hold respectively our own political parties, our own communities accountable with respect to any incitement and anti-Semitism. We also at the same time have to call out not only flagrant Holocaust denial and distortion. You mentioned, for example, the COVID pandemic, which almost since its inception, has blamed Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, for manufacturing the COVID virus, for causing its spread, from profiting from it, the use of a classic anti-Semitic trope, the poisoning of the wells and the like. But there are other phenomena that have to be called out and exposed. I'm referring to the trivialization or minimization of the Holocaust, or the misappropriation of Holocaust symbols and imageries, where anti-vaxxers will compare themselves as they wear a yellow star to being inmates at the death camp Auschwitz. This has to be unmasked and shamed. We have Holocaust revisionism, where you have in particular amongst some Eastern European extremists, the glorification of those who were complicit with the Nazis in the Holocaust. We have Holocaust inversion with respect to referencing the Jews and Israel as being Nazis and committing Nazi crimes. And we have, of course, the amplification of this on the social media. And since most people get and learn today from the social media of sound bites rather than substance, all these are the kinds of initiatives for accountability that we have to advance and move forward on.
The big agenda. Do you think that the UN's recent resolution will help in this effort? Are there particular elements of it that we need to pay attention to?
I think it will help, number one, in raising awareness of the dangers of Holocaust denial and distortion. I think it also addresses the roles and responsibility of social media platforms in this regard. You know, the social media platforms are a rules-free universe, and we need, in fact, accountability in that universe. And the resolution calls for the monitoring in that regard. And I believe we will have to have a dual approach where the social media platforms regulate themselves as gatekeepers who have to be accountable. But where that is not done, then in fact, governments will have to undertake our international legal responsibilities, as I said, to prohibit incitement to discrimination, hostility, violence, and the like. And, you know, the data that has been coming out has been fundamentally disturbing about the weaponization of the social media in this regard. Just 2 days ago, reporting just on the Twitter platform alone, over 4 million anti-Semitic tweets, or TikTok, which has amongst its adherents those mainly between the ages of 16 and 25, 1.2 billion users. Well, as the studies now shown, a 918% increase of anti-Semitic content in 1 year with respect to TikTok. So wow. We are talking about real amplifications of anti-Semitism in social media. And here too, we need a legal policy framework with respect to accountability and justice.
Professor Cutler, in our engagement with social media companies, we've called on them to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition, the IRA working definition, and to use it to train the content moderators and asking them to adjust their internal algorithms. You know, these algorithms sometimes bring people to Holocaust denying sites rather than, and reinforce that rather than try to correct the presentation of the truth. Now, so far, the social media companies have only taken on parts of the IRA definition. Even content that they recognize as anti-Semitic, like Holocaust denial, seems to still be flowing freely. And wondering if you could share any thoughts with us about what you think Canada might do with this problem in the coming year, and how to get these companies to recognize the full range of anti-Semitic speech as harmful. You spoke about legal measures. We usually speak about non-legal measures. Even the IRA working definition is a non-legal tool in that context. I'd really be interested in your thoughts on this. Well,
as you mentioned, the algorithms, instead of monitoring and removing, tend to incentivize and amplify hate. I found it intriguing that Maria Ressa, a journalist who received the Nobel Peace Prize for herself being an exponent of freedom of expression in the best sense of the word, has herself expressed concern about as she put it, the weaponization of social media who are amplifying hate and incitement. And so in this regard, I'm pleased that Canada has announced that it will be introducing legislation, both human rights legislation and amendments to the criminal code to protect against incitement to hate that is amplified on the social media. You know, we have a Supreme Court judgment this on a set of cases concerning Holocaust denial of 30 years ago, where the court in a landmark set of judgments held at the time and has been sustained since, that, if I may quote from the judgment, that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers, said the court. It began with words. These are the chilling facts of history. These are the catastrophic effects of racism. That was in, if you will, in the pre-internet age, which has been so amplifying and weaponizing the hate. So I hope that the legislation, because what we have with regards to social media companies is a rules-free universe. And when we speak of a rules-based international order, then we have to, in fact, give expression to it. And what's important here is that this hate clearly knows no borders. So we need the internationalization of legal remedy. That's why IRA is so important, because it's not only the working definition of anti-Semitism, it's not only the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international consensus definition that we have, but what is not so well known is that it's the most representative, that it was adopted after a 15-year decision-making process, democratic decision-making process by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments. For example, the Interparliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism Conference in Canada, in Ottawa, November 2010, adopted the exact metrics that are now in the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, as well as civil society leaders, scholars engaged in it. I myself was part of the International Drafting Committee. And by the way, historically, interestingly enough, it was established in the wake of the Durban World Conference Against Racism in Durban, which turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. You were there, Felice. We were there working together in common cause. And it was as a result of that conference and the manifestation of hatred there that the metrics adduced from that experience made their way into the drafting. And I might say in 2005, the European Council to Combat Racism and Xenophobia adopted what effectively became the IRA working definition some 11 years later, when it was unanimously adopted by IRA itself. What makes it important, I'll just conclude, is that it's non-binding, it's in effect a resource, it's a tool, it's an asset that if you can't, for example, recognize, identify anti-Semitism, if you can't define it, then you can't effectively monitor it and combat it. And that's why it's important both for social media companies to adopt it, but it has to be mainstreamed throughout our culture.
Big task. We're looking to you for guidance in how to do this and how to bring together both the importance of limiting this kind of speech and ensuring that you preserve room for robust free expression.
As you mentioned that, I'm always mindful of the fact, I had my legal education in the States at the graduate work at Yale Law School, subsequently taught at Harvard Law School. I mention it only because very often you hear, that all speech is protected speech under the First Amendment. But as my colleagues at Yale Law School taught me, that's not the case. That misrepresents the First Amendment and freedom of expression. For example, under the First Amendment, perjury is not protected speech because of the need for the right to a fair trial. Treason is not protected speech because of the right to human security. Child pornography is not protected speech. I can go on. Fighting words are not protected speech. So the notion that all speech is protected speech and therefore we can't have any regulation with regard to the internet is simply misleading as a matter of fact and as a matter of law.
Professor Cutler, I'm painfully aware of the passage of time, and we want to be sure to leave time for questions and answers from our, what is a global audience following this today. Earlier today at the UN's Holocaust Remembrance Program, Elisha Wiesel, the son of a Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel, was one of the speakers. In his remarks, he asked if the people listening to him would be brave enough to follow his father's example. And he specifically addressed the Uyghur Muslim community in China and what's happening. Now, AJC's Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, which I direct, and the Raoul Wallenberg Center, of which you are the international chair, have both said that the Uyghurs are victims of an ongoing genocide by the government of China, involving arbitrary detention of millions of people in re-education camps where they face torture, including sexual violence, victims of forced labor, separation of children from their families forcibly, and a concerted effort to destroy Muslim religious sites and to criminalize the very expression of Uyghur religious and cultural identity for the purpose of eliminating it. In contrast, the United Nations Secretary General and the political bodies of the UN have been quiet about this horrible situation. Oh, sure, some governments have spoken out and issued statements, but the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Secretary General of the United Nations have said nothing. The political bodies, like the General Assembly, have said nothing. Now, in his remarks today, Elisha Wiesel said it's incumbent on everyone to avoid being complicit in China's persecution of the Uyghurs through their participation in the Olympics. And he directed a part of his call clearly to the Secretary General, but also to other governments. Secretary General Guterres is going to Beijing for the opening of the Olympics next week and has publicly stated that he has no intention of raising the Uyghurs or other human rights matters with the Chinese government. He says he's just going to accept a meeting with the International Olympic Committee and their invitation. Professor Kahler, what guidance do you have for those of us who are seeking to do more to prevent and curb this ongoing genocide? The Chinese government has launched a counter campaign to suppress the truth about what is being done to the Uyghurs and trying to silence global opposition to it. They seem to be doing a pretty good job. What more can we do?
Well, one of the things is to recall and act upon the words of Elie Wiesel himself, who would remind us again and again of the danger of silence in the face of evil, and what could be more evil than acts that are constitutive of genocide, and the responsibility, as he put it, to speak up and act against injustice. And then also, as he would say, of the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of massive trial. In other words, what makes the Holocaust, and let's say the genocide of the Tutsis, 10,000 Tutsis were murdered every day for 3 months. What makes these things so unspeakable are not only the horrors themselves, but that these genocides were preventable. Nobody could say, we did not know. We knew and we did not act. Right now, with regard to the Uyghurs, nobody can say, we do not know. We know and we must act. And we've had clearly documented reports of these mass atrocities, whether they've emanated from the US Holocaust Museum or whether from our own Raoul Wallenberg Center or parliamentary hearings. And I might add, the Canadian Parliament became the first parliament to make a determination that what was happening to the Uyghurs were acts constitutive of genocide. Just a few days ago, the French National Assembly in France made a similar determination. So I would have expected the Secretary General, number one, not to go to the Olympics, to join the diplomatic boycott, which the leaderships of Canada and the United States and others have engaged in, and certainly not to go and say nothing when he is there. So I think Elie Wiesel's lessons, the Secretary General who quotes Elie Wiesel should himself listen to what he is quoting and act upon it. I might say as well, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which was founded some 18 months ago, of which I'm the co-chair from Canada, has itself been engaged not only in the mobilization of shame, against the human rights violator China, but in fact in initiating action to hold Beijing accountable. What we need is a parallel community of democracies at the governmental level to parallel what is happening at the parliamentary level, because China has been able to bully the democracies one by one, Australia, Japan, Canada. But since we've formed our Interparliamentary Alliance, then that asymmetrical bullying has been arrested and is being reversed, and an intergovernmental alliance would help. We also should call upon the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who says she has a report, to produce that report. We need to advance these concerns at the UN Human Rights Council. At the same time, countries should replicate what the US has done, bar the importation of slave labor, regulate exports to China, which may be used as building a surveillance society. And the last thing I would say is in this regard is that we need to both mobilize shame against the human rights violator and hold Beijing to account in every forum, governmental, parliamentary, diplomatic, the Olympic Games themselves.
Quite an agenda. Thank you for that. I'm now at the point where I'm actually a few minutes over. So I turn the floor back to Claire and the audience questions.
Thank you, Felice. Our first question is coming from AJC leader Janice Allen and many others who are asking about the importance of confirming a U.S. special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. As you know, the Senate continues to delay the confirmation of the extremely qualified Deborah Lipstadt in this role with the rank of ambassador, placing many Jews at risk. What's the importance of this role, and if confirmed, how might the two of you work together on issues of global anti-Semitism?
Well, number one, Professor Lipstadt is an exemplary candidate, and I regret that she has not yet been confirmed. Her voice and her vision will certainly enhance the combating of anti-Semitism and the preserving of Holocaust remembrance and the like. And one of the reasons, as you know better than I, that she has not yet been confirmed has been the politicization of the confirmation process. I would hope, I've called for this, but certainly the AJC and others, that politics and politicization has to be put aside, and therefore the Senate should confirm Deborah Lipstadt with all deliberate speed. She will be not only an enormous resource with respect to the combating of anti-Semitism on the international level, but she is somebody that we can all work together with in common cause. It happens that on a personal level, we are old and good friends and have worked together over the years. Frankly, I can't wait until that appointment is in fact confirmed. And I think you will see a dramatic, inspirational voice, not only on the American, but on the international scene, joining the group of special envoys for that purpose.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Betty Keith in Palm Beach. You've spoken a lot about the role of governmental bodies and big organizations in combating Holocaust revisionism, distortion, and denial. What about those of us on the call who are passionate about these issues, but aren't really acting from an institution? What can we do?
Well, we may not all be able to be Raoul Wallenbergs, but Raoul Wallenberg, when asked, as I said, why he did what he did, he said, quote, "For me, there was no other choice." I think we have to see it as a matter of obligation. And the day of International Holocaust remembrance should be not only a day of remembrance, which it is, but it should be a day of remembrance to act. And each one of us, in our own way, can have a transformative impact. I remember always the teachings of the sage Rambam, Maimonides, who said that we should each see the universe as being half good and half evil. Then one good deed by any one of us on any given day can have a cosmic influence of transforming the ledger from evil to good. So I think what we need to do is each, in the best as we can, to in fact make sure that we speak out, make sure that we unmask and expose hatred, discrimination, and anti-Semitism from whatever source, and that we become part of a constituency of conscience, domestic and international, that holds governments, others accountable, particularly governments who are themselves engaged in state-sanctioned and incitement to hate. But let us not remember and not forget and always act upon the notion that one person acting with integrity can make a difference. That's what Raoul Wallenberg taught us and can inspire us to do.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ronnie Levin, who's asking, if the pandemic had never happened, would we still see a sharp rise in the inappropriate and unacceptable use of Holocaust imagery, or did it exacerbate an already worrying trend?
It effectively exacerbated a worrying trend. That is the most recent of tropes. In effect, it's part of the generic trope of the Jews as the poisoners of the wells. The pandemic became a convenient trope for that purpose. But we had this before, as I said, the notion of Jews as the enemy of all that is good, and the embodiment of all that is evil is a trope from time immemorial, and reflected always whatever is the zeitgeist of the times. When the zeitgeist was Christianity, then we were guilty of deicide. When the zeitgeist had to do with the dangers of black plagues, then we were the poisoners of the wells. When the zeitgeist became human rights, and it has been that way, when human rights emerged as a new secular religion of our time in the 70s and has continued since, then Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, have been held out to be the meta human rights violator, the new antichrist of our time. So this is not new. It's just that the pandemic and its amplification on the social media has incentivized it and amplified it, but the roots are what they've always been. The conspiratorial tropes are there as they always have been, and it's our responsibility to unmask, to expose, to hold accountable, and we each can do it in our own way. The Doctors Against Racism in Canada, Racism and Anti-Semitism in Canada, known as DARA, they've instituted the teaching of courses on medicine and the Holocaust in almost every medical school in Canada. We are now trying to get courses on law and the Holocaust in law schools in Canada. We each, in our own professions, in our own fields, can mobilize our respective cohorts to engage. And I think if we take the Soviet jury model, in which Felice Guerre and I were involved in, we patented, if you will, intersectionality. We had artists for Soviet jury, scientists for Soviet jury, parliamentarians for Soviet jury, academics for Soviet jury, students for Soviet jury, women's for Soviet jury that were an international goal. We need to do the same thing now with regard to anti-Semitism. Take intersectionality, bring it back as we patented it, and begin to domesticate and globalize it for advocacy purposes.
Thank you. Jeff Novenstein in Santa Barbara is asking, Canada did not establish the position of special envoy until very recently. Can you speak to why maybe it took so long? Was there a lot happening on the front just without an official position?
There were things that were happening without an official position. As I said, Canada hosted, for example, the Interparliamentary Conference about Anti-Semitism in 2010. That brought together over 60 parliamentarians from, some 70, some 50 countries at the time, and itself adopted the Ottawa Protocol to combat anti-Semitism and the like. I think Canada was late in appointing or establishing the position of a special envoy, and in fact, when they did it, I have 6 intersecting mandates. I'm responsible for preserving Holocaust remembrance domestically and internationally, for combating anti-Semitism domestically and internationally, for heading up the Canadian delegation to IRA, as Felice has mentioned, and also to be the special envoy to intergovernmental bodies like the EU, the Organization of American States, and the like. So it has allowed me to have a holistic perspective, but my counterparts, for example, in the US would be, 3 to 4 people doing the same position. And it took until the Malmo conference to establish the Office of Special Envoy, number 1, as a permanent office, 2, to provide a budget for it. And I hope soon I will have the resources to more effectively implement the important mandates that have been given.
Thank you. And this will be our last question before I turn it back to you, Felice. The news about Holocaust denial and all the sources of anti-Semitism is often overwhelming. Are there any efforts or practices that really give you hope that we're making a difference in fighting those forces? And how can we make sure that young people are fully involved in those efforts?
Well, I think it's very important, particularly to get young people involved. Some of the data that has come out, as you know, on these matters has been disturbing. Just 2 days ago, a study was released in Canada that 33% of high school students believe that the Holocaust, talk about the Holocaust, is exaggerated or fabricated. Or another study that showed 50% of millennials can't name one death camp, including Auschwitz. But the encouraging thing I found in the data is that 92% wanted to learn more about the Holocaust. So what we need at this point is we have to see the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil, anti-Semitism as a paradigm for radical hate, the intersection of the two, and mandate the teaching both of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism at the high school level, if not beginning in higher elementary school levels. Education is the antidote with respect to the growing either ignorance or distortion or trivialization or minimization of the Holocaust. And education is crucial to get us to not only understand and learn about the lessons of the Holocaust, what I would call the universal lessons of the Holocaust, some of which I referenced earlier in my talk, but to get us to act on those universal lessons. That is what's crucial, and education can be the gateway for that purpose.
Well, it falls to me to thank Erwin Kotler for this masterful survey of not only of the world, but of the world from the perspective of the anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and the need to correct and improve the world on issues ranging from the Uyghur genocide to just about everything else you can think of. He is Canada's treasure. He's our treasure. We're enormously grateful to him, and we're also grateful to AJC for having provided this opportunity for us to talk a bit about these very disturbing but enormously important policy concerns and how to address them. So thank you, Erwin, for your insights, advice, and we'll be back at work on these issues as soon as we close this program. So thank you.
I just want to close with saying that you, Felice, are an incredible resource, and not only for the United States, but for us in Canada and internationally. What you have done with respect to learning about and combating anti-Semitism these last few years, in particular, has been sans pareil, without a parallel. And you have an incredible, inspirational leader in David Harris. So the AJC and the Jacob Blaustein Institute are exemplars of what the best of leadership is all about.
Thank you, Professor Cutler and Felice, for today's important and insightful conversation. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. As we heard today, the memory of the Holocaust and its lessons for humanity are under assault like never before. If you'd like to join American Jewish Committee in confronting this dangerous trend, you can do so in several ways. First, visit ajc.org/confirm-Lipstadt to urge the Senate to swiftly confirm Professor Deborah Lipstadt as the U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. And you can explore AJC's Translate Hate Glossary, which empowers you to identify, expose, and report anti-Semitism. You can learn more at ajc.org/translate hate. Thank you again, and goodbye.